first time in the history of the South End, we actually have an umbrella organization that tries to bring everybody together, all the neighborhood associations together under one roof, open to everyone, free to speak your mind and create an agenda that's important to you as a neighborhood, but always focused on the common interests of the entire South End.
My name is Maisharia Weir-Lytle. I'm the president and CEO of United South End Settlements, and it's just amazing to look out into this crowd and to see all of our neighbors who've showed up tonight for a really important conversation about the evolution of our neighborhood, but also really thinking about the future of the South End Lower Roxbury neighborhood.
So let me say a few words about the book and about myself. So I'm a sociologist teaching at the University of Paris 8 in Saint-Denis, which is a poor community on the outskirts of Paris. And I can tell that I've always put some kind of commitment to social justice in my work, probably in this project about the South End, although I want to claim that this book, Good Neighbors, is first of all a scientific book. So the goal of the book is not to condemn gentrification or gentrifiers. The book doesn't seek to distinguish between the good guys and the bad guys of gentrification, nor does it assess good intentions and bad intentions. And it is also a scientific book in the sense that I don't have the solutions to stop gentrification or control real estate market. I wish I had, but I don't. Yet I hope my book can help having a discussion about these very important issues. My book is not a history of the South End. It develops arguments that are not limited to the South End, and these arguments revolve around gentrification, diversity, and class. So let me elaborate a little bit about two of these arguments. First of all, my book brings into light power relations that play out in gentrified neighborhoods. This might be a bad news, sorry, but there are power relations in mixed neighborhoods like the South End. Today, a lot of South End residents claim that the South End is diverse. From a demographic point of view, this might be true, although diversity is a very relative notion. As the sociologist Elijah Anderson wrote, what whites see as diverse, blacks may perceive as homogeneously white and relatively privileged. More importantly, proximity between different groups does not ensure equality. And that might be something social science are useful to, is to really make this point. In other words, people of different colors, people of different socioeconomic backgrounds can live in the same neighborhood, thus challenging residential segregation that has a long history in the US. However, this cohabitation does not necessarily erase differences and end inequalities. Sometimes it even reinforces them. And I argue that inequalities are reinforced when a group sets the tone by imposing its own lifestyle, its own social norms, based on a high level of income. And the history of the South End is the history of this appropriation that implies taking ownership, literally and symbolically. My book shows that there's been economic violence in the South End, but also a symbolic violence that also happened by way of a narrative of the neighborhood. This narrative contributed in making the immigrants and low-income residents invisible by associating them to the decline that followed the glorious day of the 19th century. Simultaneously, this narrative that was used to gain the designation of the South End as a landmark district, this narrative praised the pioneers' efforts to restore the past beauty of the buildings and made them the only legitimate residents. But are they? My book also analyzes the central role of diversity in gentrifiers' identity and their strong, also particular commitment to support to supporting diversity. I don't know if you know the book by Jane Jacobs, published in 1962, The Death and Life of Great American Cities. In this book, Jane Jacobs criticized urban renewal policies which destroyed the rich urban neighborhood and instead created artificial and isolated communities. In her book, Jane Jacobs provided a vivid description of Greenwich Village in Manhattan, where various groups of people constantly meet and interact. Jacobs' model still pervades gentrifiers' representation of themselves and their neighborhood. Strong social ties, small local businesses, pedestrians on the street, these are the elements my interviewees mentioned to illustrate the diversity they like. But what do they like? And what do they do in the name of diversity? What struck me when I met for the first time in 2004, the leaders of the neighborhood associations or the member of neighborhood association in the South End, is that they claim to represent the community, whereas their organizations are so strongly class-based. Yet, as I spend more time in the South End, I realized that they seek to socialize newcomers to diversity. By moving to a neighborhood like the South End, a lot of newcomers often face a level of diversity that they are not familiar with. And neighborhood association leaders acknowledge these fears and try to turn these fears into something positive. Not the exclusion of others, but the praise of diversity. At the same time, and that might be an interesting or an important point of discussion here, their attitudes, resting on this praise of diversity, reflect a concern for social balance based on a representation of the others as positive, yet always potentially dangerous. The way they consider low-income people and minorities remains structured by a clear opposition between the dangerous population and the deserving one. Actually, this is the principle of philanthropy. Thus, the upper middle class residents' mobilization aims to construct good neighbors. It means having accepting newcomers on one hand, but also limiting the presence of low-income residents and people of color to the obedient and the minimally visible on the other hand. Well, to conclude, and as an answer to a South End resident who didn't like my book and didn't like the fact that I'm French, as he explicitly said, I would like to finish this presentation with a celebration of transatlantic exchanges. In a conference I attended in Chicago this week, an interesting and actually accurate idea came up. French people are good at studying class, and Americans at analyzing race relations. American historians wrote very challenging books about the French government of Vichy during the Second World War, about its role in the deportation of the Jews, and about the Algerian Independence War. Coming to the US as a French person, I was probably more inclined to investigate class cleavages, class inequalities, which are not often acknowledged in a country where most of the people think of themselves as middle class. In the 19th century, Tocqueville pointed to this paradoxical situation of industrial countries like England, whose wealth was getting enormous while so many people lived in poverty. We haven't overcome this paradox. Western democracies have promoted equal rights that come hand in hand with enduring inequalities. And it seems that progressive and beautiful neighborhoods such as the South End live in the same paradox. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Sylvie. Thank you very much. And we look forward to hearing a whole lot more about the conversation that you've started here. So again, good evening. My name is Carl Long. I am the chair of the board here at United South End Settlements and also a South End resident since 2001. And on behalf of the board of USES, welcome to the Harriet Tubman House and thank you for being here. Since 1976, this version of the Harriet Tubman House has served as an important community resource, one where adult learners will come and earn a GED. In fact, during graduation, they walk and receive their diplomas right here. A place where workers come and are taught new skills in technology. A place where seniors come and jazzercise and sing platinum harmonies. And it's also been a place where we've had this serve as the living room for our neighborhood. Essentially a place where important conversations about life in the South End can be held. And I'm certain that tonight's discussion will certainly be in keeping with that tradition. So it is my distinct privilege and honor to introduce the moderator for tonight's forum, the Honorable Representative Byron Rushing.
Let me begin in this conversation by reiterating something that Masharia said during her introduction, that we are here because most of us live in the South End, have lived in the South End, are concerned about the South End, and we want to see if this evening we can carry on a conversation that answers this question of, do we like what we've become? And I would ask you in answering that to also be asking and answering, and what else do we want to do? What else do we want to be? And I see that as the focus for this conversation. We're not going to stop people from making comments about things they didn't like about the book, or things they don't like about the author, or things that they, right? We're not going to stop you for doing that, but let's focus on what we can leave here with that will help us have the next conversation. And I think we have the audience that is able to do that. I'm not sure if we would have gotten all these people in the room if we had simply said we want to have a meeting on Thursday night to talk about gentrification. Right? I don't think you all would have come. But let me tell you, right? Being able to say we're going to talk about this book, Good Neighbors. That's right. And so if we had, and if you hadn't written the book, we would have figured out a way of having somebody else write a book so that we could get this group of people to be here, ready to listen and question and to talk. So this is very, very important. Let me say just, there's so many things that I could say about the South End, and I'm not allowed to do that because I really am the moderator. But I want people to understand that this book is sociology. I know I've talked to lots of people who have wanted this book to be history. They have wanted to have a history of the South End. And someone has written one, and it's just been published, and I'm going to plug it later on in the program. Unfortunately, the author, Russ Lopez, who is planning to be here this evening, had a death in his family and has had to go out of town. But this is sociology, and I just want people to just have that in their head when we're talking about this, which also means when this work was done is very important. And that we're talking about work that was, as I understand the book, includes visits from 2004 to 2010. Right? Over a year's worth of time in that, but that's the period, and that's the South End we're talking about. There are parts of the South End in that book that's been talked about that's really not here anymore. Bits and pieces that are not here anymore. And there, of course, there's lots of it that's the same, but it is not a discussion of the South End in 1965, or 1975, or 1985, although there are many references to those periods in the book. So, with those questions, with that little piece of how do we look at this book, I would then invite the panelists to say a few introductory remarks and the direction in which they are hoping the conversation will go. And we'll do the same order.
Okay, great. Well, good evening. I'm really honored to be here tonight and to be on this panel with Sylvie and with folks who have been friends and mentors of mine for many years. I've been part of the South End community for 25 years, first as a youth worker, and for 16 years I've been the vicar of St. Stephen's Church on Shawmut Ave and the executive director of St. Stephen's youth programs. We meet the out-of-school time needs of about 225 young people every afternoon at our 2 locations. The other one's on Lenox Street in Lower Roxbury, and we run a summer program for over 650 young people in Boston at 6 locations and in Chelsea. I do bring the perspective, obviously, of a church person, one who feels that faith communities are an important part of the fabric of a place. In my time in the South End, I've seen several churches close. They've been sold to developers by congregations that moved out of the neighborhood, often because their members were pushed out of the neighborhood. Very visibly, we're all witnessing the transformation of New Hope Baptist Church on the corner of Tremont and West Concord, but also the Jesuit Urban Center, Concord Baptist, the Salvation Army Harbor Lights, which had a very active faith community. And most recently, we've now seen the very dramatic design for Trinity Church further up on Shawmut Avenue, the old German Catholic church, which I learned today will have condos offered at $4 million. There are at least 4 other churches I can think of that have been repurposed in the neighborhood over the years. Churches and faith communities have been anchors in the South End, providing not just Sunday services, but human services, programs for youth and seniors, food pantries, meeting spaces for community organizations, including recovery groups, just a place for people to turn in times of need for pastoral care, counseling, and advocacy. Some of them, including St. Stephen's, have played key parts in organizing movements in the history of the South End. ETC and EBA, which led to the development of the Via Victoria, were born in the parish hall at St. Stephen's. Churches are also the containers for community history, the places where generations of people were baptized and married and given a final send-off. They have a unique and deep connection to people who live and have lived in our neighborhood. So as we think about the question, do we like what we've become, we might think about what a neighborhood with fewer and fewer churches and other faith communities looks like, and who else is going to take up those critical roles that churches have played over the years.
Chris.
Good evening. I just want to echo what Tim just said, but I grew up in the South End. I was born at Boston City Hospital, and I wanted that listed in the bio because it's now Boston Medical Center. And I was curious to know if anybody was curious to know where Boston City Hospital was. Living in cathedral projects, we say housing development, I got the benefit of being in an incredibly mixed community. Shortly after that, moving to Shawmut Ave. And I'd like to say, being the youngest of 8, it wasn't just my parents that raised me. The South End raised me. And it's great to see a lot of people here who are a part of that, a part of my being now. I can remember the Blackstone Community Center is the place that kept me safe when it was children needed a place to be, especially in the wintertime. The St. Stephen's Church was a place that I got a great deal of care and learning. Right here at the United South End Settlements, I was a camper, and I was in nursery school right in these services here. So I owe a lot. I feel like I owe a lot to what was given to me, and that's why I continue to be active as a member of the board of directors here at USCS, active in my church and active in my community in general. And it's interesting to look out into the audience here and not see a lot of the people that I grew up with because they don't live here anymore. And so that's one of the things that's a change in my observation. And one of the things that Sylvie mentioned in her remarks, and it struck me, is when she was talking about social norms. One of the things that all South Enders take pride in is saying hello to each other, and stopping and talking and exchanging. And I find myself in the last few years having to train newcomers that's how we do it. We stop and we talk, we get to know each other. And when we do that, we're able to share history, we're able to share more of what the South End is. And so it's a struggle sometimes, because I talk to other South Enders and it's like, why are their heads down and they're walking and not looking up? That's not how we are. That's not how we've been. And it's a curiosity of what is going on for that dynamic to take place. And because it's not that people are bad and mean and don't want to talk, it's not a social norm. And I want that to come back. And so that's, if there's a campaign to get started, that'd be one of the campaigns, is the hello, I'm a South Ender, you're a South Ender, let's get to know each other and become community through that. I also think it's important to recognize that my time, I learned community organizing. I learned community activism through all of the mentors around me. And so it almost automatically flowed into that role myself. And we were able to come together through all different backgrounds and say, what is it that we can do to make our community safer, healthier, better? And I'm really happy about the history of people having to come together and put real energy into saying, let's not just have an event for young people. Let's not just have an event for this group. Let's have an event for everybody that everyone feels a part of and that there's real ownership for. And that's one of the things I'm feeling that we're losing as well. This community ownership, especially of the young people. If young people don't feel accepted and appreciated and regarded as assets, they're not going to engage on any other level. And I think it's important. The other observation is that there's an incredible amount of wealth that's here. There's an incredible amount of intelligence and access. And if just a fraction of that were extended to the younger people, what we would develop in the way of leaders, what we would develop in a way of strength in this community. And so that's my observation was there's so much to draw from, but we've got to find a way to open this can and recognize that it cannot be just for this one thing. If we create something, all the stakeholders ideally should get some benefit from it, not just a few. And I really want us to think about the young people in this community that are not getting the benefit of the incredible wealth that it continues to grow in this community.
Hi,
Thank you.
I'm Joyce King. And I guess first off, apart from the fact that I've lived in the South End for at least 1,000 years. So be careful. I am all of your elders. I think that a gathering like this around such a piece of, a book rather, should encourage us to appreciate the neighborhood that we are. And we all, a lot of us, almost everybody knows a certain amount of the history of the neighborhood. But to appreciate who we are, that we are actually a multiracial, multilingual South End. And sometimes it appears as if something is missing. And so I think having conversations like this perhaps will allow us to talk about and think about what is not happening. There are good points about the changes that have happened, and at the same time, we have to talk about the not so good things that have happened, that at some point affect everybody who lives in the community. And so I would hope that reading the book and having a discussion and having more than one discussion, that we are able to say, this is who we have been, this is who we are becoming, this is who we are now. How much of it do we need to keep? How much of it do we need to, push away or change in some way? And we have to be, I would say, brave enough to be able to say some of those things instead of hiding that we're so great and the neighborhood is great. I'm still here, so I guess it is. But I think it's talking about who we are. So a piece of the book that struck me was this word diversity. And I think if we're going to talk about diversity as a neighborhood called the South End, we have to have a common definition. And I have not seen it or heard it. And so I think that's an important beginning if we believe that we live in a multiracial neighborhood. Diversity is not just a word. It is, for me, it's a behavior. It's a way of thinking, feeling, being. And it is important to have a common understanding so that when South End people talk about diversity, people have a sense, especially other South End people, know that we're all together on this. And that's the missing piece that as I have lived here all these 1,000 years, that has gone away, that is less and less. So when Chris talks about all that he grew up in, I'm Chris's elder. And so my kids grew up the same way. And so they appreciate, so when they hear the word diversity, they know what it looks like, feels like, sounds like. And I don't have a sense that there is that in terms of who we are now, who we have become, and I think that's something I would like to see us wrestle with. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Steve Fox, and I'm kind of feeling like, because I'm the neighborhood guy, the neighborhood association guy, that I might be a little bit like the skunk at the garden party. Because as anybody who has read any of the reviews of Sylvie's book or the book itself will tell you, neighborhood associations didn't exactly come in for a lot of accolades in her research. And the reason that I wanted to participate tonight was in large part because I think that, forgive the triteness of this, but I think that the glass is really half full as we look at ourselves today in 2015 rather than half empty, for a whole host of reasons. When I first got involved in neighborhood associations about 30 years ago, I started going to my neighborhood association and the same 4 people sat around a table in the South End Library and talked about similar kinds of things, including the potluck supper, which was the annual event that everybody looked forward to. But in terms of dealing with serious issues that affected the neighborhood or that had larger impacts across the entire South End, it really didn't happen. And I participated in at least a half a dozen efforts to try to draw the entire South End together in terms of all of the neighborhood associations. Back then there were 23 independent neighborhood associations, to say nothing of 2 business associations. Today we only have 15 and 2 business associations. And for the first time in the history of the South End, we actually have an umbrella organization that tries to bring everybody together, all the neighborhood associations together under one roof, open to everyone, free to speak your mind and create an agenda that's important to you as a neighborhood, but always focused on the common interests of the entire South End. So if you have a zoning issue in your particular neighborhood or a licensing issue, your neighborhood association is best equipped to deal with that. But if we're talking about issues like trash collection or plowing or development or economic opportunity, those are South End-wide issues, and we needed a structure to try to find a way for us to be able to deal with that as an entire South End-oriented neighborhood association. It's taken us a very long time to get to that point, but I think that we're beginning to get there in some kind of sense of permanence. And so that's why I think that we are in a position where the glass is really half full rather than half empty. The only other thing that I wanted to mention is that I was particularly struck by the depiction of the dog recreation space at Peters Park in Sylvie's book, and how that came into, how that was depicted in terms of how people saw that. Was it really an assault on the existing structure and culture and the diversity that existed in that park? Or was it an attempt to really solve a problem? And I have to come down on the side of looking at the issue from the perspective of those people. By the way, in 2004, there were 38,000 dogs in the city of Boston. 38,000. Only 8,000 that were registered, 30,000 that were unregistered. And the dog problem in Boston was significant. And so when people got together and said, we have a problem with this. There's dog stuff everywhere. You know, people are intimidated by the dogs in the park that are unleashed. You know, this is a serious problem that we need to deal with. And it really was, I think, a really turning point in the history of the South End when we began to think we need to solve this problem together at the same time that we're sensitive to the needs of the people around the neighborhood. And what I hope we did in terms of crafting a piece of legislation at the city level, and then eventually putting in place a pilot program, and then the very first dog park in the history of the city of Boston, long after every other major city had already done it 10 times over, we were able to finally solve a problem. So while you can view what happened as an assault on the neighborhood, or, you know, an influx of different values, what we did, I think, was solve some problems. So I'm on the side of those people who want to solve problems and that want to see the South End as willing to engage in talking about how we deal with those problems at the same time that we're sensitive about issues like diversity and issues like, are we really dealing with the issues that are important to the people of the South End? And that's important as well, but I hope that we also understand that solving basic problems of everyday life are also equally important.
Thank you. Yes. So let's feel free to ask each other any questions. I want to stay on this diversity thing for a minute, and I think Joyce, you raised an interesting fact about diversity, and that is we all know. I mean, it doesn't take a person very long to be in the South End to know that if you ask anybody what they like about the South End, if you ask them if you know that in the top 2 things, diversity is going to be there, in the top 3, diversity is going to be there. You're going to hear this diversity as a reply, but that the neighborhood has been diverse for almost as long as it's existed, right? And that there was a time when people liked to talk about, that seemed to talk about diversity in a more directed, conscious way. Like you had institutions that put diversity in their names, right? So you had the Church of All Nations, right? So you have this church that decides that it's going to describe itself as a church where different immigrant groups are welcome, right? So we don't have anything like that anymore. I don't know any organization that stresses its being diverse. And I think part of this is that there are not many people in the United States that know how to live in a diverse community. So part of it is that we sometimes forget how unique this really is. Right? So for most white people in America, getting up in the morning and going to work and seeing a person of color is exception. Most white people do not see it. They don't, right? I mean, it just doesn't happen. And so, on one hand, then the South End can be diverse in a very, for them, very radical way, because they see black people on the street all times of day. So that just makes it diverse in a remarkable way. And so the question is, right, is there more to diversity that people are talking about? Or should there be? And that's a question to all of you.
Yeah. I think there has to be more. I think the importance of diversity is for me to know about him and the work that he does in the neighborhood, and that I can learn about that and participate, so that when I see him at the bakery or someplace, do you have bakeries? We do.
Expensive ones now.
But, so that there's an exchange. And what I don't see as much, well, let me say, I have a 30-year-old granddaughter who lives and works in the Dominican Republic. And she was here for 2 weeks. She just left on Tuesday. And she runs. And she always comes to visit me. She grew up in Georgia, went to Georgetown, and anyway, she's a remarkable young lady. As the grandmother, I can say that. And so she was running one day, and she came back and she said, "Grandma, I don't see many black people." She said, "The neighborhood is more white, and I have lived in my house for 50 years." So she knows the neighborhood. So if you go back to when our children, so when Chris was young, an important part of the diversity is how do we, in a casual way, connect with one another as we grow up, as we participate, instead of always having to have a meeting. And that is less and less for us in the South End. I also went to the Church of All Nations, by the way, which you may have known. And so I grew up, so my Girl Scout teacher was a Chinese woman from China. That was my Girl Scout leader. And so the Church of All Nations was a model for many of us who participated, because it brought everybody together, and we did a lot of different things, but we also learned about one another. You don't have to go to somebody's house, for instance, and eat and do any of that. You just have to have a movement in the neighborhood in which you say hello, you see one another in the coffee shop, you stop and you say a few more words. The children don't always have to go to camp to know a lot of different children. The children should be walking around the neighborhood and be acquainted with. But if we're separating ourselves, which we have, by the way, if we look at diversity of particular neighborhoods in the South End, let me say the Castle Square, Villa Victoria, Cathedral, Meth Union Manor, and Tent City are all housing developments, and they are all diverse. They're all well integrated. But if you walk up and down some of the side streets, I don't see that. And so that's a missing piece. And I don't see it, for instance, in terms of the shops up and down Columbus Avenue. So I'm not saying that we have to manufacture it, but I am saying that we need to seriously think about the community in which we live and what are we going to leave to the next group of people that are coming on. I see a lot of gray hair in the house. And so, not yours. And so, go ahead.
So, I mean, I think your question about having a shared idea of what we mean by diversity, to me goes to having a shared idea of what we mean by community. We talk about the South End community, but it's many communities. And just a quick anecdote, you know, my neighbor at St. Steve, in the condo next door, we both have trees in front of our property, and he wanted me to put a wrought iron fence and some flowers around the tree. And I said, you know, it's just not my priority. You know, we're running $1 million worth of programming for young people in the community. This is what we do. They're going to step on the flowers. He kept coming to me about this, and finally he said to me, why won't you ever do anything for the community? And I realized, I'm not condemning him, I just realized that to him the community was a completely different thing. He was thinking of a completely different thing than I think of when I think of the community. So how do we have a shared idea of what it means to be the South End community when we may be starting from very different places?
You know, one of the big frustrations that I hear repeatedly from neighborhood associations is how we get people to show up. And I know that that's something that nonprofits and faith-based institutions and others face as well. But you can extend as much outreach as you want, but unless people are willing to come and engage in the dialogue with you about how we approach this issue or how we manage that issue, mundane issues like parking all the way through to economic development.
Yeah.
Unless you can get people to show up, then your diversity objective gets waylaid. And so the challenge for us, and I'm serious about looking for new strategies to help find ways to get people to show up, is to really do as much outreach as we can. And I know that many neighborhood associations have tried everything that they can. And we're stymied, I mean, in many ways in the South End to get that. Unless it's an issue that really sort of all of a sudden is on the front page and people get excited about it. But the normal routine stuff of managing the neighborhood and helping to move it forward sometimes gets stymied because people don't show up.
But you have to invite people. Yeah. And you can't invite people to neighborhood organizations if neighborhood organizations have the culture of being homeowners. So if the culture is to be homeowners, then there's a whole bunch of people who are not invited.
Or English language only speakers.
Or English language only. They're not invited to a South End wide organization. If the South End wide organization is an organization of the neighborhood associations, which are really organizations of homeowners, right? So we have to figure out a way then to adjust to being welcoming. Right? And so, you know, I'm an Episcopalian too. We joke about the fact that we have a sign out in front of every Episcopal church has a sign that says the Episcopal church welcomes you, right? And most people in America don't believe that, right? So it's an active thing that you have to do, right? So we have, and the other thing is that actually we do need to look at ourselves, at the neighborhood itself, and see where the diversity actually does happen. Right? I've missed Halloween this year, but Halloween is one of the most diverse, it's the most diverse day in the South End. There is no, right? Now what do we do with that? Then shouldn't we do something with figuring out what you do with that? You know? But we have very few institutions like this one, or like the public library, where everybody feels they can walk in, right?
Just an anecdote, 750 pieces of candy gone by 7:30.
You got it. And you know, and 2 years ago, I was on Pembroke Street, and I was sitting on the stoop, right? And now, see, I have to. One of the things about my job is I have to go everywhere, right? So I can't. There's no group of people in my district that I can say, you know, I prefer over another group. But so I'm on the stoop in Pembroke Street, and the kids are just coming, and this woman comes out of the house, and she says, "Where are all these kids live?"
Yeah, it's interesting.
So, we have to, right.
Memory-wise, I remember, again, growing up, there was me and my brother, 2 white Irish kids, 2 Puerto Rican kids, Jewish kid, Syrian kid. That was our norm. We didn't know anything else. That's how we saw the world, through this mix. And becoming an adult and active as a community organizer, we were grappling with what do we do to bring people together. And we were doing okay with bringing young people together. So how do we get their parents out? How do we, because we wanted to diversify our community that way. And so we were like, well, let's give them an award. Then parents have to come out. We got creative though. We had to think of different ways. We had essay contests. You get 20 kids win. Then you have all the parents come out and honor them in that event. But that was the way. We had to get creative in getting people out, because it wasn't as simple as inviting them, because we tried it and they didn't show up. So we had to get them to come out somehow, and that did work. Yep.
Thank you. So we're gonna open this up now to the audience, but I want Sylvie to just comment on anything she heard from us.
Can I say something? Okay.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, I do think that Joyce made a very important point, saying that there is a need for discussion of the definition of diversity. We can't hear you. Oh, okay.
Thank you.
Well, I was saying that Joyce made a very, very important point, saying that there is a need for discussion about the definition of diversity, but I would like to add something else, and maybe it's difficult to question, but there might be a need for also questioning even the notion of diversity. I know it's a value which is at the core of American liberalism and how American liberals define themselves, but in a way, I'm wondering whether this value of diversity doesn't also work to obscure other values or other watchwords or other principles, such as rights. I mean, what about rights to housing, or rights to healthcare, or rights to, not being discriminated against? And I'm wondering whether, being committed to diversity can very easily go hand in hand with a total ignorance of these other issues.
If you want to make the neighborhood associations more welcoming, when you hear people in your neighborhood association ask a question of a developer, are there going to be any Section 8 people there? And when the developer responds, no, only nice people will be there. Yes, this is true. Yes, it's true. And when you hear somebody say, when they were trying to do the committee to end elder homelessness, when you hear the president of the neighborhood association say, we don't want them because they're old, because they're poor, and because they're women. Yes. In any event, this is what I have heard, and this is what has made me less likely to go to these neighborhood associations. The same way with the landmark, when they had they designated the landmark. If you were going to repair your fence, it had to be wrought iron. Not everybody can do that. And that, causes homes to go down. People can't fix them. So there's a whole set of ideas that people have that they don't even realize what it does. They don't realize what it does to the people who are less fortunate. And when you hear about the rents that are going up, my next door neighbor, her rent went up in the space of less than a year from $1,400 to $2,000, and she had to move. And she was a young white woman. But the thing is, you have to take that into account, and you have to say, stop. It's not all about greed. It's not all about making a huge profit. And unfortunately, that's what the South End has turned into.
Helene, I was struck by what you had to say, and I think one of the things that we do have to acknowledge is that through gentrification, there has been insensitivity. And you're absolutely correct in terms of saying that there have been developers who have come into the South End and have wanted to make a fast buck and really don't care about the fabric of the South End or the kind of housing options that are getting created and the impact that that has on the overall fabric of the South End. I think that's happened. But in 30 years of dealing with neighborhood associations, while I'm aware that that happens, I've never seen it happen in neighborhood associations per se, or have I seen it endorsed by neighborhood associations. And so I'm challenged by what you said tonight to ensure that that will never happen again. And when all the neighborhood associations meet again next Tuesday, I'll bring up this comment that you've made in terms of ensuring that people are sensitive to that issue and understanding what a turnoff it is and how little it does to encourage people to become participants in the overall neighborhood association initiatives. So I appreciate what you said. I hope that we're beyond that in some ways today. Not that there aren't greedy developers out there, but I'm challenged to go back to the neighborhood associations and say, be sensitive to this.
So I've been here for a while and I've seen lots of changes, and people ought to know that the kinds of conflicts that are described in this book between those who want to provide for low-income people and those who don't was a fight that has gone on for all of the decades that we've been here, and that neighborhoods change, and that many of the people who left because finally they were able to get out. One lifelong liver in the South End described how it was bad to live in the South End, and as soon as people had a chance to get $8,000 or $10,000 or $12,000 or more for their property, they got out. When I moved into our street, West Rutland Square, we were the only white family on the street for many years, and today our neighbors are the only black family on the street. That is the reality that Joyce King described, and it is the one positive that I get out of Sylvie Tissot's book, which I'm very critical of, but that's the one thing that she did bring to our attention, the fact that we are changing. And my question is, or answering the question that's been raised about what we do about it, I say the one thing we can do about it is to allow for the vast number of children who live in this community and who would like to attend the public schools. One of the things missing from Sylvie Tissot's book is any reference to children. Children are the glue of the neighborhood. Children are the ones who meet others in the class and whose parents then arrange to get together with others. And we still have an assignment process which says to parents who want their children to go to school that it's a crapshoot. And many people leave the South End because they don't want to subject their children to that crapshoot. And what we need is to make sure that schools like the Hurley School, which has been taken away and created into this wonderful place, which is similar to the Rice Bancroft School that our children attended, are places that people in the South End should be able to send their children to. And if we can't get them all in there, by golly, we ought to have schools, because it's the kids, as Chris Cato points out, which is our salvation. And I'm not sure how we get black families back into the neighborhood, but I think it starts with caring parents, of some means who too want their children to be in diverse places.
The human capital that we have here is something that does kind of level the playing field for a lot of people. Part of it, though, is what some of the other participants have mentioned: getting out of your houses, meeting people, making an effort to get to know everybody around you.
If we're going to be welcoming, is you have to meet people where they are. I think we sometimes are just working under these old assumptions about how things used to be or how families used to be. The American family has changed so much, and the amount it takes to just keep your family moving forward. And I'm obviously speaking as a parent with young children who, you know, is working. Both of us are working, all kinds of other things, but to be able to just come to an event or be able to make a neighborhood association meeting, that's a really, really difficult thing, and you're certainly not going to do it if it doesn't feel welcoming. But to acknowledge, you know, the changing family and the multiple kinds of things that we're trying to balance, it oftentimes is not a matter of do I go or do I not, but how do I balance it with the 10 other things that are going on right now. And so I think if we're going to make progress on this issue, we have to acknowledge the families who are here, who I think are feeling somewhat bashful about should they dip their toe in the water, but it's not easy given the reality of their entire lives and all the things that are going on.
Most families of colors in this neighborhood are poor families, are low-income families. And those are the families that have a number of demands on their plates in raising a family here in this neighborhood, and that may find it very difficult and perhaps not the top priority to go to a neighborhood meeting on any given night. No matter what night you think is the most convenient night. It may not be convenient for a family that is struggling to put bread on their table, or to pay rent, or to figure out where their kids will go to school, or to figure out if they will have public transportation to get to work the following day. So I think those are, you mentioned about meeting people where they are. So people have a lot of number of demands in front of them. So perhaps, you know, a way to engage everyone in this conversation and make this neighborhood a true community, whereas the word diversity that we've spoken so much about tonight becomes really a community, a weaved community of people who care about each other, who not only say hi on the street, but also care truly about each other, is that perhaps neighborhood associations, in addition to, you know, being concerned about important things like trash pickup, snow shoveling, parking issues, park issues, etc., that we as a community think, okay, well, like Helene was saying, next development in the community, how many affordable housing units are going to be developed there? We as a community want them here. We don't want them anywhere else. We want affordable housing for low-income and for middle-income families, the ones that don't qualify for subsidized units, and the ones that can certainly not afford rent or a home if they want to buy a home here in this neighborhood. So I think that's a start. So as the neighborhood and neighborhood associations really thinking, so how do we put together, so where is the next development, and how do we really push for that to happen here, so we have that diversity of socioeconomic status.
My name is Duffy. I've lived within 2 blocks of my present address at the corner of Gray and Clarendon for 76 years. I'm a little confused tonight because I don't know if we're talking about diversity or change. But I'll tell you that I'm not at all unhappy with the changes that have happened in my community, the South End. And I think it's real important that the neighborhood associations become more involved with the change that's going to come. Whether you like it or not, it's going to happen. Another 50 years, South End is going to be a lot more different. And as far as diversity, go to Beacon Hill, Back Bay. You won't see a group like this. You won't see a group like this. In fact, I rather doubt if they've even have a discussion about it. I think it's a wonderful community, and it's wonderful because of the thing we're doing right now. I have not read Sylvie's book, and I waited deliberately because I wanted to hear the brouhaha that went around it, and there has been a big brouhaha about it. I wanted to hear what everyone had to say that I know here in the South End before I read Sylvie's book. And now I'm looking forward to read it, and I rather doubt that I'm going to feel at all negative about the book, because if nothing else, it's caused all of us to get together and talk about the kind of a neighborhood that we really want to live in. Boy, I do love it.
Thank you. Does anyone want to give any closing remarks?
I certainly learned a lot tonight, even though I talked more than I probably should have. But one of the things that has struck me is that working with neighborhood associations for the past 30 years, in my own neighborhood association, we kind of have a joke. Instead of the Rutland Square Association, we call it the Rutland Square Authority, because in many ways we do a lot of the stuff that the role of government should really take on. We raise money to plow our alleyways. We raise money to clean our parks. We raise money to do X, Y, and Z that are typically the role of government. So part of what you're seeing in the neighborhood association evolution of the South End has been sort of taking up the slack where government has not really performed all of the functions that are necessary. The only other thing that I would say, and I'll close, is keep in mind that everybody in your neighborhood association is a volunteer. It's 100% of their time is volunteer. Nobody gets paid to do any of this. And so we need to be conscious of the fact that everybody is spending their time in doing good work to the benefit of their neighborhood. Okay?
You know, going back to the question of half full, half empty glass, I think that my book provides a slightly different and maybe more nuanced perspective on neighborhood association, even though I believe that, in fact, neighborhood associations have built an authority, to use the word you use. It's a very particular authority, and in my view, it has to be discussed and questioned, but I'll leave it to you to know more about the argument of the book. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and thank you for bringing us here this evening, Sylvie.
We're now having to refight this fight, right? Resources are limited. So it means other things like criminal justice policy might not be talked about as much, like social welfare policy might not be talked about enough. We're having to refight fights in an era of hyperpartisanship.